In this video, I'm going to try and explain to you what you need to do with the interpretations element of the History A-level coursework. Now, the interpretations element is a really important element of the coursework because it's actually 25% of the marks. And just to remind you, although I'm sure you know, the 40 marks in total are allocated for the coursework in the following ways. You get 20 marks for AO1 for your explanation and argument, 10 marks for sources, and 10 marks for interpretations. I think the 10 marks for the interpretations are to an extent some of the easiest ones to get on this piece of coursework. Now, this is exactly what the exam board say you need to do for AO3. In other words, what you need to do for the interpretations bit. And there's a lot of words here, but I wanted to focus in on a few things that I think are important. Firstly, you need to have an understanding there are limitations on historians, so we need to think about what limitations they might be. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more depth in a minute. You need to show that interpretations come from a context of the time that they were written. We'll come back to that. Really importantly, it does actually state in the fourth bullet point that you need to use academic historians, so you need to be really careful about the way that you do this. I don't think interpretations that you lift from a student textbook work. I think these need to be published, proper academic historians. That does not mean that your interpretation couldn't come from a popular source like a newspaper, but I think the best interpretations really are actual history books. And when you talk about the interpretations, you definitely need to use short quotations, paraphrase it, and/or footnotes. Now, let's talk in a little bit more depth about what it means you actually need to do. And what you really need to do for the interpretations, the most important thing by far, is you need to have a 700-word section where you are going to analyse two interpretations in depth. So somewhere in your essay, you are going to have a 700-word section where you just talk about two interpretations. And you do not need to use more than that. And the exam board are really explicit about that. And actually, those people who in the past have done more than two interpretations, I don't think they've done them in the right depth, and actually they've lost marks. So your 700-word section looks at two interpretations. Those two interpretations need to be on the same content. Now, what I mean by that is going to vary question to question. But for example, if I was doing the question on was liberty the main cause that the US entered wars, I'd want my two interpretations to be about the same war. So for example, I'd want them on the Second World War, both of them. Because you cannot compare and contrast an interpretation from the First World War and the Second World War. That makes no sense. The interpretations have got to be about the exact same content. If I was doing the question about transatlantic slave trade and its impact, I'd want my two interpretations to realistically be about the same geographical location. So either both be about Bristol, both be about Barbados, or both be about Cape Coast. It will work better that way. Those interpretations work best where they contrast. So the best sections are where you have historian A says this, historian B says something completely different. Now actually, you can get away with your interpretation section where the historians actually agree. But it works better if you can find contrasting ones. So I think choosing those two interpretations is fundamental to your essay. You need to decide where the interpretation section sits best in your essay. And this is going to be completely dependent on what question you do and the essay plan you have. Some students in the past have actually written the entire essay and left the interpretation section to the end. That can work. Or it might be that you decide to put it in the middle at the point where you cover the content they are talking about. So again, going back to that idea, if I was doing that question about to what extent was liberty the main reason that the US entered the war, and both of my interpretations were on the Second World War, it seems obvious to me that my interpretation section would be exactly after my section on the Second World War. That makes sense. You need to decide where that section works best in the flow of your essay, because we can't just shoehorn it in. It's got to work in the flow. That's important. Now, in that 700-word section, this is what you need to do. Firstly, you're going to explain what each historian thinks about your chosen topic. So you're going to do that in a little bit of depth. And I'd really imagine that you're going to write probably 100 words for each historian minimum about what they think about your chosen topic. So historian A thinks this about the 1960s feminist movement in the United States. Historian B thinks this about the feminist movement of in the 60s in the United States. In that, you're going to have to use quotes from that historian to prove that you understand their argument. You don't need to use loads, and it might be that you paraphrase. So rather than using long sections, you say historian A explains this point, and you explain it in your own words, but making sure that you footnote it. The second bit is probably the most important, and this is the bit where I think it really matters about which interpretations you choose, because you have to choose interpretations where you can talk about some of the following things, because you have to explain why that historian might have that particular interpretation. So you might want to consider the context of the time. For example, some historians who were writing at the height of the Cold War had certain opinions about the Soviet Union and the way that they were working. That makes sense because of the context of their time. Some historians, like Howard Zinn, write with a very specific political ideology. He is a left-wing historian. He talks about that. It influences the way he sees the past. Some historians talk about the sources they use. You also might want to consider the purpose of their writing. Is the historian writing for the public, an academic viewpoint? Why are they writing that piece of work? What is the purpose that they are trying to achieve? Now, it's really important that you choose a historian where you can actually talk about some of that background there. Every year, a student will find an absolutely brilliant interpretation, but they can't actually tell you anything about the historian. That means they can't really do this. You need to pick a historian where you can definitely talk about their background and what they're doing. That is key. And then lastly, in that 700 word section, you give your opinion about which historian or which interpretation you think is most valid to your question. Really importantly, I've said to your question, not necessarily to you, but which historian's interpretation helps answer the question the best do you think. If you do that, that's going to be 700 words, because the first bullet point here, explain what the historian thinks. As I've said, I think that'll probably be 2, maybe 300 words. In the second section, you talk about their strengths and the limitations of that historian based on their context, their ideology, and so forth. That will probably give you another 200 or 300 words, and then you give your opinion at the end, taking you up to 700. I think a really easy way to do this before you write that 700 word section is to take a copy of this table here. Make a copy of it, note down your points before you get anywhere near it. So for historian A, summarise what they think, summarise what B thinks. In the second row here, why do they have that view? Think about the strengths and the limitations that each of those historian has in terms of the purpose, their political view, their background, their context. Do that for both historians. Lastly, think about what your view is. If you do that, you'll have a structured grid ready to write that 700 word section. There are some things you definitely want to avoid though. Do not trash the historians completely. Remember, you are an 18-year-old student. Most of these historians have PhDs and have been studying their entire life. Therefore, it does come across quite naive if you go in and say historian A is a complete moron. You need to use much more moderate language than that. You can say things like, they overemphasize, they're too wedded to the idea that. The time that they are writing has clearly influenced their views and made them focus upon. Tone down the language. Don't trash them completely. Please also do not make the clangor of saying they weren't there at the time so they don't know. That's something that even my year 7s don't say, so that when a year 13 says it, it grades badly and it loses you marks. Every year somebody says that. Please also do not say, because of their ethnicity they must think that. It's a very odd way of thinking. Just because of your ethnicity, it does not mean that you're going to have a specific viewpoint. It grates when you read it, it doesn't work. Avoid those kind of phrases. The best candidates, though, definitely do use that academic debate between those two historians, often to frame their entire essay. Really good candidates will often introduce that academic debate in the introduction, right at the start of their essay. That academic debate will then be weaved through their whole essay. And it's not just apparent in that 700 word section, it's everywhere.